Section 4 of Irish Wit and Humour. The author is anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James Carson. John Philpot Curren. Part 2. Speaking of universal emancipation, he says, "This paper, gentlemen, insists on the necessity of emancipating the Catholics of Ireland, and that is charged as part of the libel. If they had waited another year, if they had kept this prosecution pending for another year, how much would remain for a jury to decide upon? I should be at a loss to discover. It seems as if the progress of public information was eating away the ground of prosecution. Since its commencement, this part of the libel has unluckily received the sanction of the legislature. In that interval, our Catholic brethren have reobtained that admission which, it seems, it was a libel to propose. In what way to account for this, I am really at a loss. Have any alarms been occasioned by the emancipation of our Catholic brethren? Has the bigoted malignity of any individual been crushed? Or has the stability of the government or that of the country been weakened? Or is 1 million of subjects stronger than 4 millions? Do you think that the benefit they have received should be poisoned by the sting of vengeance? If you think so, you must say to them, you have demanded emancipation, and you have got it. But we abhor your persons. We are outraged at your success, and we will stigmatize by a criminal prosecution the adviser of that relief which you have obtained from the voice of your country. I ask you, do you think, as honest men, anxious for the public tranquillity, conscious that there are wounds not yet completely cicatrized, that you ought to speak this language at this time to men who are very much disposed to think that, in this very emancipation, they have been saved from their own Parliament by the humanity of their own sovereign? Or do you wish to prepare them for the revocation of these improvident concessions? Do you think it wise or humane at this moment to insult them by sticking up in a pillory the man who dared to stand forth as their advocate? I put it to your oaths. Do you think that a blessing of that kind, that a victory obtained by justice over bigotry and oppression, should have a stigma cast upon it by an ignominious sentence upon men bold enough and honest enough to propose that measure? To propose the redeeming of religion from the abuses of the Church, the reclaiming of 3 millions of men from bondage, and giving liberty to all who had a right to demand it. Giving, I say, in the so much censured words of this paper, giving universal emancipation. I speak in the spirit of the British law, which makes liberty commensurate with and inseparable from British soil, which proclaims even to the stranger and sojourner, the moment he sets his foot upon British earth, that the ground on which he treads is holy and consecrated by the genius of universal emancipation. No matter in what language his doom may have been pronounced, no matter what complexion, incompatible with freedom, an Indian or an African sun may have burnt on him, no matter in what disastrous battle the helm of his liberty may been cloven down, no matter with what solemnities he may have been devoted upon the altar of slavery, the moment he touches the sacred soil of Britain, the altar and the god sink together in the dust. His soul walks abroad in its own majesty. His body swells beyond the measure of his chains, which burst from around him, and he stands redeemed, regenerated, and disenthralled by the irresistible genius of universal emancipation. Mr. Curran was here interrupted with the loud and irresistible acclamations of all within hearing, when, after a long interval, the enthusiasm had in some degree subsided, he thus modestly alluded to the incident: "Gentlemen, I am not such a fool as to ascribe any effusion of this sort to any merit of mine. It is the mighty theme, and not the inconsiderable advocate, that can excite interest in the hearer. What you hear is but the testimony which nature bears to her own character. It is the effusion of her gratitude to that power which stamped that character upon her." He concludes with this brilliant peroration: "Upon this subject, therefore, credit me when I say I am still more anxious for you than I can possibly be for him. Not the jury of his own choice, which the law of England allows, but which ours refuses, collected in that box by a person certainly no friend to Mr. Rowan, certainly not very deeply interested in giving him a very impartial jury. Feeling this, as I am persuaded you do, you cannot be surprised, however you may be distressed, at the mournful presage with which an anxious public is led to fear the worst from your possible determination. But I will not, for the justice and honor of our common country, suffer my mind to be borne away by such melancholy anticipation. I will not relinquish the confidence that this day will be the period of his sufferings, and however mercilessly he has been hitherto pursued, that your verdict will send him home to the arms of his family and the wishes of his country. But if, which heaven forbid, it hath still been unfortunately determined that because he has not bent to power and authority, because he would not bow down before the golden calf and worship it, he is to be bound and cast into the furnace, I do trust in God there is a redeeming spirit in the Constitution, which will be seen to walk with the sufferer through the flames, and to preserve him unhurt by the conflagration." After this brilliant speech, when Curran made his appearance outside the court, he was surrounded by the populace who had assembled to chair him. He begged of them to desist, in a commanding tone; but a gigantic chairman, eyeing Curran from top to toe, cried out to his companion, "Arrah! Blood and turf! Pat, don't mind the little darlin'. Pitch him upon my shoulder." He was accordingly carried to his carriage and drawn home by the people. Encounter with a fishwoman. There was a fishwoman in Cork who was more than a match for the whole fraternity of her order. She could only be matched by Mrs. Scutcheen, of Patrick Street, Dublin, the lady who used to boast of her bag of farthings, and regale herself before each encounter with a penworth of the droppings of the cock. Curran was passing the quay at Cork, where this virago held forth, when, stopping to listen to her, he was requested to go on out that. Hesitating to retreat as quick as the lady wished, she opened a broadside upon Curran, who returned fire with such effect as to bring forth the applause of the surrounding sisterhood. She was vanquished for the first time, though she had been 30 years on the stones of the quay. Curran and Lord Erskine. Dr. Crowley, in speaking of the two great forensic orators of the day, draws a comparison between the circumstances under which both addressed their audiences. When Erskine pleaded, he stood in the midst of a secure nation, and pleaded like a priest of the temple of justice, with his hand on the altar of the Constitution, and all England waiting to treasure every deluding oracle that came from his lips. Curran pleaded, not in a time when the public system was only so far disturbed as to give additional interest to his eloquence, but in a time when the system was threatened with instant dissolution, when society seemed to be falling in fragments round him, when the soil was already throwing up flames. Rebellion was in arms. He pleaded, not on the floor of a shrine, but on a scaffold, with no companions but the wretched and culpable beings who were to be flung from it, hour by hour, and no hearers but the crowd who rushed in desperate anxiety to that spot of hurried execution, and then rushed away, eager to shake off all remembrance of scenes which had torn every heart among them. His duel with Bully Egan. When Curran and Bully Egan met on the ground, the latter complained of the advantage his antagonist had over him, and declared that he was as easily hit as a turf stack, while, as to firing at Curran, he might as well fire at a razor's edge. Whereupon Curran waggishly proposed that his size should be chalked out upon Egan's side, and that every shot which hits outside that mark should go for nothing. Massey versus Headfoot. The following extract is from his celebrated speech against the Marquis of Headfoot. Never so clearly as in the present instance have I observed that safeguard of justice which Providence has placed in the nature of man. Such is the imperious dominion with which truth and reason wave their sceptre over the human intellect, that no solicitation, however artful, no talent, however commanding, can seduce it from its allegiance. In proportion to the humility of our submission to its rule, do we rise into some faint emulation of that ineffable and presiding divinity, whose characteristic attribute it is to be coerced and bound by the inexorable laws of its own nature, so as to be all wise and all just from necessity rather than election. You have seen it in the learned advocate who has preceded me, most peculiarly and strikingly illustrated. You have seen even his great talents, perhaps the first in any country, languishing under a cause too weak to carry him, and too heavy to be carried by him. He was forced to dismiss his natural candor and sincerity, and having no merits in his case, to take refuge in the dignity of his own manner, the resources of his own ingenuity, from the overwhelming difficulties with which he was surrounded. Wretched client, unhappy advocate, what a combination do you form! But such is the condition of guilt. Its commission mean and tremulous, its defence artificial and insincere, its prosecution candid and simple, its condemnation dignified and austere. Such has been the defendant's guilt, such his defence, such shall be my address to you, and such, I trust, your verdict. The learned counsel has told me that this unfortunate woman is not to be estimated at £40,000. Fatal and unquestionable is the truth of this assertion. Alas, gentlemen, she is no longer worth anything. Faded, fallen, degraded, and disgraced, she is worth less than nothing. But it is for the honor, the hope, the expectation, the tenderness, and the comforts that have been blasted by the defendant, and have fled forever, that you are to remunerate the plaintiff by the punishment of the defendant. It is not her present value which you are to weigh, but it is her value at that time, when she sat basking in a husband's love, with the blessing of heaven on her head, and its purity in her heart; when she sat amongst her family, and administered the morality of the parental board. Estimate that past value, compare it with its present deplorable diminution, and it may lead you to form some judgment of the severity of the injury and the extent of the compensation. The learned counsel has told you, you ought to be cautious, because your verdict cannot be set aside for excess. The assertion is just, but has he treated you fairly by its application? His cause would not allow him to be fair, for why is the rule adopted in this single action? Because, this being peculiarly an injury to the most susceptible of all human feelings, it leaves the injury of the husband to be ascertained by the sensibility of the jury, and does not presume to measure the justice of their determination by the cold and chilly exercise of its own discretion. In any other action it is easy to calculate. If a tradesman's arm is cut off, you can measure the loss he has sustained, but the wound of feeling and the agony of the heart cannot be judged by any standard with which I am acquainted. And you are unfairly dealt with when you are called on to appreciate the present sufferings of the husband by the present guilt, delinquency, and degradation of his wife. As well might you, if called on to give compensation to a man for the murder of his dearest friend, find the measure of his injury by weighing the ashes of the dead. But it is not, gentlemen of the jury, by weighing the ashes of the dead that you would estimate the loss of the survivor. The learned counsel has referred you to other cases and other countries for instances of moderate verdicts. I can refer you to some authentic instances of just ones. In the next county, 15,000 pounds against a subaltern officer. In Travers and McCarthy, 5,000 pounds against a servant. In Tye against Jones, 1,000 pounds against a man not worth a shilling. What then ought to be the rule, where rank and power and wealth and station have combined to render the example of his crime more dangerous, to make his guilt more odious, to make the injury to the plaintiff more grievous, because more conspicuous? I affect no levelling familiarity when I speak of persons in the higher ranks of society. Distinctions of orders are necessary, and I always feel disposed to treat them with respect. But when it is my duty to speak of the crimes by which they are degraded, I am not so fastidious as to shrink from their contact, when to touch them is essential to their dissection. However, therefore, I should feel on any other occasion a disposition to speak of the noble defendant with the respect due his situation, and perhaps to his qualities, of which he may have many to redeem him from the odium of this transaction. I cannot so indulge myself here. I cannot betray my client to avoid the pain of doing my duty. I cannot forget that in this action the condition, the conduct, and circumstances of the parties are justly and peculiarly the objects of your consideration. Who then are the parties? The plaintiff, young, amiable, of family and education, of the generous disinterestedness of his heart, you can form an opinion even from the evidence of the defendant, that he declined an alliance which would have added to his fortune and consideration, and which he rejected for an unportioned union with his present wife. She too, at that time, young, beautiful, and accomplished, and feeling her affection for her husband increase, in proportion as she remembered the ardor of his love and the sincerity of his sacrifice. Look now to the defendant. Can you behold him without shame and indignation? With what feelings can you regard a rank that he has so tarnished, and a patent that he has so worse than cancelled? High in the army, high in the state, the hereditary counsellor of the king, of wealth incalculable, and to this last I advert with an indignant and contemptuous satisfaction, because, as the only instrument of his guilt and shame, it will be the means of his punishment and the source of his compensation. The Serenading Lover. In the very zenith of Curran's professional career, he was consulted in a case of extremely novel character, which arose out of the following circumstances. Not many doors from Eden Quay, in Upper Sackville Street, lived a young lady of very fascinating manners, and whose beauty had attracted considerable attention wherever she made her appearance. Amongst the many gentlemen whose hearts she had touched, and whose heads she had deranged, was one young Englishman, a graduate of Trinity College, and about as fair a specimen of the reverse of beauty as ever took the chair at a dinner of the Ugly Fellows Club. Strange to say, he above all others was the person on whom she looked with any favour. Men of rank and fortune had sought her hand, lords and commoners had sought the honour of an introduction, but no, none for her but the ugly man. In vain did the ladies of her acquaintance quiz her about her taste. In vain did her family remonstrate upon the folly of her conduct in refusing men of station for such an individual. No go, none for her but the ugly man. Her dear papa only seemed to take the affair in a quiet way. Not that he was indifferent about the matter, but he loved her too much to throw any obstacle in the way of her happiness. Not so, however, with her brother, a splendid young fellow, whose mortification was intense, especially as the whole affair was the theme of ridicule among his fellow students in old Trinity. He, though sharing in all the love and tenderness of the father, could not understand his quiet resignation. What is it to be thought of that one who was the butt of the university, one on whom nature had played her fantastic tricks, should be the person who held the key to his lovely sister's heart? No, the father might resign himself to this quiet philosophy, but he, at least, would have none of it. It should never be said within the college walls that he looked tamely on while a farce of this kind was being played out, especially as some of his most intimate fellow students, and a beloved one in particular, took more than a common interest in the matter. On a summer morning, in the middle of July, he was coming out of his hall door, when the postman handed him 2 letters, one of which was directed to his sister. Suspecting the party from whom it came, and that a knowledge of its contents might lead to some discovery useful to him in frustrating the writer's designs, he opened it, and found that his suspicion was correct, and that himself was the object of complaint for his manner towards him in college. And further, that as he was about to leave for England on the following day, and would not return for some weeks, he would do himself the honour of serenading her at 12 o'clock that night. After reading the letter, his first thought was to look to the condition of his horsewhip, but after a little quiet reflection, he resolved upon another plan of action. Breakfast over, he proceeded to the kitchen, summoned all the servants to his presence, to whom he related the whole story from beginning to end, and proposed that they should drench him with water when he made his appearance under the window. But there happened to be among them a corpulent lady called Betty Devine, who entered a plea of objection to that mode of proceeding on the grounds of waste of water; that in Edinburgh, where she had served for 7 years, they wouldn't think of such waste, and that if the young master would only leave the matter in her hands, she would drown the musician in a chorus. the like of which was not to be heard outside the boundaries of bonny Scotland. To this proposition on the part of Betty the young gentleman gave a hearty assent, adding at the same time a hope that her want of practice since she had left Edinburgh would be no obstacle to her success. To which Miss Devine replied by asking him to name the window out of which she was to present her compliments to the English minstrel. "As to that, Betty," said he, "I leave you to select your own ground, but take care that you don't miss fire." An observation which took the stable boy, Bill Mack, by the greatest surprise, as, from Betty's powers of administration in his regard, a faded dark brown coat the master gave him had been restored to its original colour. For once in her lifetime Betty found herself mistress of her situation, and having made her arrangements, dispatched Bill Mack with an invitation to some of her stable friends of the Quay to witness the forthcoming concert at 12 o'clock that night. Scarcely had the hour arrived, however, when the serenader made his appearance, dressed in the pink of fashion, and placing himself under his lady's window, proceeded to play the guitar in the best style. The performance hadn't well commenced, when, throwing his eye to her lattice high, he beheld a female figure in the 2-pair window, which she opened gently, then commenced his best effort in the art divine. No doubt it was the lady of his love that was there, about to reward him with nature's choice gifts from above, not the wax artificials of these days, but the real gems, which he hoped to preserve on his passage to England. That he saw a female figure was but too true. It was Miss Betty Devine, who had been arranging that portion of her toilet which might endanger the free exercise of her right arm. This done, Miss Devine stood forward, and grasping a certain utensil of more than ordinary proportions, with one bound not only returned its lining on the night, as Tom Moore says, but also on the head of the devoted serenader, who was so stunned by Betty's favour that it was some time before he realized the nature of the gift. His nasal organ having settled all doubt in that respect, he made his way from the crowd, vowing law and vengeance. "What is the matter?" asked a popular commoner on his way from the Parliament House to one of the boys of the Quay. "It's a constart, your honour, given by Betty de Scotch girl. De creature's fond of harmony, and for my part, the tongue is stickin' to the roof of my mout from de fair dint of de chorus. I didn't taste a drop since mornin'. Aye, boys, ain't ye all dry?" This appeal having met with a favourable response, the gentlemen of the Quay retired to drink his honour's health and to wash down the music. Meanwhile, the next morning the serenading gentleman went in all haste to his brother-in-law, one of the leading merchants of the city, to whom he communicated the occurrence of the previous night. He had scarcely finished when the merchant took him off to his attorney, who, without further delay, went with them to the residence of Curran, to have his opinion on the case. When they had finished, Curran at once gave his opinion. "Gentlemen," said he, "in this country, when we go to see a friend or acquaintance, all we ever expect is pot luck." Carew O'Dwyer was the first who had the honour of proposing that Curran's remains should be brought over from England and laid in Glasnevin. Charles Phillip's first introduction to Curran took place at the Priory, a country villa about 4 miles from Dublin. Curran would have no one to introduce him, but went and took him by the hand. Lundy Foot, the tobacconist, was on the table under examination, and hesitating to answer. "Lundy, Lundy," said Curran, "that's a poser, a devil of a pinch." Employment of informers. I speak not of the fate of those horrid wretches who have been so often transferred from the table to the dock, and from the dock to the pillory. I speak of what your own eyes have seen, day after day, during the course of this commission, from the box where you are now sitting. The number of horrid miscreants who avowed upon their oaths that they had come from the seat of government, from the castle, where they had been worked upon by the fear of death and the hopes of compensation, to give evidence against their fellows; that the mild and wholesome counsels of this government are holden over these catacombs of living death, where the wretch that is buried a man lies till his heart has time to fester and dissolve, and is then dug up a witness. Is this fancy, or is it fact? Have you not seen him, after his resurrection from that tomb, after having been dug out of the region of death and corruption, make his appearance upon the table, the living image of life and of death, and the supreme arbiter of both? Have you not marked, when he entered, how the stormy wave of the multitude retired at his approach? Have you not marked how the human heart bowed to the supremacy of his power in the undissembled homage of deferential horror? How his glance, like the lightning of heaven, seemed to rive the body of the accused, and mark it for the grave, while his voice warned the devoted wretch of life and death, a death which no innocence can escape, no art elude, no force resist, no antidote preserve. There was an antidote, a juror's oath, but even that adamantine chain, which bound the integrity of man to the throne of eternal justice, is solved and molten in the breath that issues from the informer's mouth. Conscience swings from her mooring, and the appalled and affrighted juror consults his own safety in the surrender of his victim. Informers are worshipped in the temple of justice, even as the devil has been worshipped by pagans and savages. Even so in this wicked country is the informer an object of judicial idolatry. Even so is he soothed by the music of human groans. Even so is he placated and incensed by the fumes and by the blood of human sacrifices. Curran and the farmer. A farmer attending a fair with £100 in his pocket took the precaution of depositing it in the hands of the landlord of the public house at which he stopped. Next day he applied for the money, but the host affected to know nothing of the business. In this dilemma the farmer consulted Curran. "Have patience, my friend," said the counsel. "Speak to the landlord civilly, and tell him you are convinced you must have left your money with some other person. Take a friend with you, and lodge with him another 100, and then come to me." The dupe doubted the advice, but, moved by the authority or rhetoric of the learned counsel, he at length followed it. "And now, sir," said he to Curran, "I don't see as I am to be better off for this, if I get my second 100 again." "But how is that to be done?" "Go and ask him for it when he is alone," said the counsel. "Ay, sir, but asking won't do. I's afraid without my witness, at any rate." "Never mind, take my advice," said Curran. "Do as I bid you, and return to me." The farmer did so, and came back with his 100, glad at any rate to find that safe again in his possession. "Now, sir, I suppose I must be content, but I don't see as I am much better off." "Well, then," said the counsel, "now take your friend with you, and ask the landlord for the £100 your friend saw you leave with him." It need not be added that the wily landlord found that he had been taken off his guard, whilst the farmer returned exultingly to thank his counsel with both hundreds in his pocket. Curran and the Judge. Soon after Mr. Curran had been called to the bar, on some statement of Judge Robinson's, the young counsel observed that he had never met the law as laid down by his lordship in any book in his library. "That may be, sir," said the judge, "but I suspect that your library is very small." Mr. Curran replied, "I find it more instructive, my lord, to study good books than to compose bad ones. My good books may be few, but the title pages give me the writers' names, and my shelf is not disgraced by any such rank absurdities that their very authors are ashamed to own them." "Sir," said the judge, "you are forgetting the respect which you owe to the dignity of the judicial character." "Dignity!" exclaimed Mr. Curran. "My lord, upon that point I shall cite you a case from a book of some authority, with which you are perhaps not unacquainted." He then briefly recited the story of Strap in Roderick Random, who, having stripped off his coat to fight, entrusted it to a bystander. When the battle was over, and he was well beaten, he turned to resume it, but the man had carried it off. Mr. Curran thus applied the tale: "So, my lord, when the person entrusted with the dignity of the judgment seat lays it aside for a moment to enter into a disgraceful personal contest, it is in vain, when he has been worsted in the encounter, that he seeks to resume it. It is in vain that he tries to shelter himself behind an authority which he has abandoned." "If you say another word, I'll commit you," replied the angry judge. To which Mr. Curran retorted, "If your lordship shall do so, we shall both of us have the consolation of reflecting that I am not the worst thing your lordship has committed." Curran's quarrel with Fitzgibbon. Curran distinguished himself not more as a barrister than as a member of Parliament, and in the latter character it was his misfortune to provoke the enmity of a man whose thirst for revenge was only to be satiated by the utter ruin of his adversary. In the discussion of a bill of a penal nature, Curran inveighed in strong terms against the Attorney General Fitzgibbon for sleeping on the bench when statutes of the most cruel kind were being enacted, and ironically lamented that the slumber of guilt should so nearly resemble the repose of innocence. A challenge from Fitzgibbon was the consequence of this sally, and the parties having met, were to fire when they chose. "I never," said Curran, when relating the circumstances of the duel, "I never saw any one whose determination seemed more malignant than Fitzgibbon's. After I had fired, he took aim at me for at least half a minute, and on its proving ineffectual, I could not help exclaiming to him, 'It was not your fault, Mr. Attorney, you were deliberate enough.' The Attorney General declared his honor satisfied, and here, at least for the time, the dispute appeared to terminate. Not here, however, terminated Fitzgibbon's animosity. Soon afterwards he became Lord Chancellor and a peer of Ireland by the title of Lord Clare, and in the former capacity he found an opportunity, by means of his judicial authority, of ungenerously crashing the rising powers and fortunes of his late antagonist. Curran, who was at this time a leader, and one of the senior practitioners at the Chancery bar, soon felt all the force of his rival's vengeance. The Chancellor is said to have yielded a reluctant attention to every motion he made. He frequently stopped him in the middle of a speech, questioned his knowledge of law, recommended to him more attention to facts, in short, succeeded not only in crippling all his professional efforts, but actually in leaving him without a client. Curran indeed appeared as usual in the 3 other courts of the 4 courts at Dublin, but he had been already stripped of his most profitable practice, and as his expenses nearly kept pace with his gains, he was almost left a beggar, for all hopes of the wealth and honours of the long robe were now denied him. The memory of this persecution embittered the last moments of Curran's existence, and he could never even allude to it without evincing a just and excusable indignation. In a letter which he addressed to a friend 20 years after, he says, "I made no compromise with power. I had the merit of provoking and despising the personal malice of every man in Ireland who was the known enemy of the country. Without the walls of the Court of Justice, my character was pursued with the most persevering slander, and within those walls, though I was too strong to be beaten down by any judicial malignity, I was not so with my clients, and my consequent losses in professional income have never been estimated at less, as you may have often heard, than £30,000. High authority. Curran was once engaged in a legal argument. Behind him stood his colleague, a gentleman whose person was remarkably tall and slender, and who had originally intended to take holy orders. The judge, observing that the case under discussion involved a question of ecclesiastical law, "Then," said Curran, "I can refer your lordship to a high authority behind me, who was intended for the church, though in my opinion he was fitter for the steeple." Use of red tape. Curran, when Master of the Rolls, said to Mr. Grattan, "You would be the greatest man of your age, Grattan, if you would buy a few yards of red tape and tie up your bills and papers." Curran and the Mastiff. Curran used to relate with infinite humour an adventure between him and a mastiff when he was a boy. He had heard somebody say that any person throwing the skirts of his coat over his head, stooping low, holding out his arms, and creeping along backwards, might frighten the fiercest dog and put him to flight. He accordingly made the attempt on a miller's animal in the neighbourhood, who would never let the boys rob the orchard, but found to his sorrow that he had a dog to deal with which did not care what end of a boy went foremost, so that he could get a good bite out of it. "I pursued the instructions," said Curran, "and as I had no eyes save those in front, fancied the mastiff was in full retreat. But I was confoundedly mistaken, for at the very moment I thought myself victorious, the animal attacked my rear, and having got a reasonably good mouthful out of it, was fully prepared to take another before I was rescued. Egad, I thought for a time the beast had devoured my entire centre of gravity, and that I should never go on a steady perpendicular again." "Upon my word," said Sir Jonah Barrington, to whom Curran related the story, "the mastiff may have left you your centre, but he could not have left much gravity behind him among the bystanders." End of section 4. Recording by James Carson.